He stood in the fluorescent stillness of his own garage, grease on his collar and silence in his chest, while the man in the charcoal overcoat laid a folded check on the workbench between them like it was a peace treaty and a threat all at once. $200,000. In exchange for forgetting everything he had seen. In exchange for disappearing from a courtroom. In exchange for pretending that the truth had never found its way into his hands. Ethan Whitaker looked at the check. He did not pick it up. And then the man in the overcoat said a name. A small name. 7 letters. The name of a 7-year-old girl who walked to a bus stop on Elm Street every afternoon and sat on a bench beneath a maple tree. The wrench in Ethan's hand became very still. What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. To understand what Ethan Whitaker was doing in that garage, you have to go back. Not to September of 2024, when all of this began. You have to go back much further than that. You have to go back to a workshop at the Nürburgring in the summer of 2010, where a 24-year-old American with borrowed tools and borrowed German was learning to hear metal the way other people hear music. His teacher was a man named Hinrich Müller, a Porsche engineer of the old school, the kind who believed that a machine well-built was a form of honesty, and that shortcuts in an engine bay were a form of lying. Hinrich did not raise his voice. He did not offer compliments casually. But he watched the young American work, and what he saw, he wrote down in a leather-bound notebook. That young man came home from Germany. He fell in love. He married a woman named Caroline, who laughed at the right things and said the hard things gently and believed in him more completely than he had ever believed in himself. They built a life together in Connecticut. And then, in October of 2020, on a Tuesday that looked like every other Tuesday, Caroline died. Stage 4. 32 years old. Hannah was 3. Ethan quit his work in the European motorsport world 2 months later. He came home to Stamford, opened a 2-bay garage on Pacific Street, and became the kind of mechanic people called when no one else could find the problem. He drove a 2014 Ford F-150. He lived above his shop. He picked his daughter up from school and made pasta on Tuesdays and read to her every night until she fell asleep. He did not talk about Germany. He did not talk about Hinrich. He did not talk about what he used to know. That was Ethan Whitaker, a man in a grease-stained work shirt with a Stamford zip code and a reputation in a narrow corner of the world that the rest of the world had never thought to look. Vivian Ashworth had never thought to look either. She was 38 years old, a senior partner at the hedge fund she had co-founded, managing $4.2 billion in assets with the particular posture of someone who had been listened to since she was 22. Her Greenwich estate had 6 chimneys and a 6-bay garage and a partner named Preston Vance who wore cashmere in September and smiled with his teeth, but never with his eyes. When her 1973 Porsche Carrera RS began misfiring 18 months ago, she sent it to 3 dealerships and 2 specialty shops. None of them found the answer. Preston suggested she try a mechanic from Stamford that her doctor had recommended. She agreed. She did not expect much. She made a joke the morning Ethan arrived. Something about marriage. Her assistants laughed on cue. Ethan did not laugh. He walked to the car, lifted the engine cover, and stopped breathing. He recognized the bracket immediately. It was hand-fabricated. The geometry was not factory. The welding signature belonged to exactly one man in the world, Hinrich Müller, and Ethan had stood beside that man when this bracket was installed on this engine in a workshop in Germany 14 years ago. He wiped the lower edge with a microfiber cloth. The stamp confirmed it. Mr. 04. Manth Racing. Hinrich's 4th personal project outside official production. One of only 7 he had ever built. Ethan closed the engine cover. He straightened up. He asked Vivian when her father had bought the car. She told him. Frankfurt. 1991. Kept in Germany for years before importing. Ethan did not tell her what he knew. Not yet. What he told her was this. Someone had replaced a component inside the engine bay. The replacement was modern, aftermarket, and incompatible with an original modification that had been on this engine since the mid-1990s. The mismatch caused thermal expansion at around 80 to 100 miles of sustained driving, producing the exact misfire and pressure loss that 3 professional shops had been unable to diagnose. Preston Vance, standing behind her in his cashmere sweater, asked with visible amusement whether Ethan was truly suggesting that 3 certified shops had missed something this fundamental. Ethan looked at him directly for the first time. He said, "They were diagnosing a modern Porsche. This is not a modern Porsche. This is a 1973 car with modifications that appear in no factory service manual. If you do not know they exist, you do not know to look for them." Preston's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. Something small and specific, like a door closing in another room. Ethan drove back to Stamford. That evening, after Hannah was asleep, he opened his laptop and pulled up the public regulatory filings for Ashworth Capital Management. He read the firm's asset documentation. He found the Porsche. On the SEC filing, the car was valued at $385,000. A properly authenticated 1973 Carrera RS with verified provenance from Hinrich Müller, one of only 7 personal restorations the man had ever completed, would sell at auction for somewhere between $1.4 and $1.8 million. The car had been deliberately undervalued on the firm's books by approximately $1 million. And the aftermarket part that had been installed to disable the original Hinrich bracket, that installation had not looked like negligence. It had looked like intention. It had looked like the work of someone who knew exactly what they were destroying and why. There was only one person at Ashworth Capital Management who had the access, the authority, and the motive to do both of those things. Ethan sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and looked up the number of an attorney in Stamford named James Holloway. The federal courthouse in New Haven was cold on the morning of January 8, 2025. The kind of cold that Connecticut holds in the days after a storm has passed through and left everything pale and still and clarified. Ethan Whitaker sat in the witness chair in a pressed shirt and the same quiet he had carried for years. Across the room, Preston Vance sat between 2 attorneys in a suit that cost more than Ethan's lift. His tan had faded. His posture had not yet learned to carry what was coming. Ethan testified for 47 minutes. He described the engine bay. He described the bracket. He described the stamp, MR04, and what it meant and why it mattered, and what it told anyone who had the knowledge to read it. He described the thermal mismatch. He described the aftermarket replacement and the precision with which the original modification had been disabled. He described the regulatory filing and the gap between the documented valuation and the true market value of the car. He described the forensic accountant's finding, $14.2 million in broader irregularities across the fund, of which the Porsche had been merely the first visible thread pulled loose. And then he described the afternoon of November 23rd, when a man in a charcoal overcoat had come into his garage on Pacific Street and placed a folded check on his workbench. He described the $200,000. He described his refusal. He described the moment the man had said his daughter's name and told him which bench she sat on after school. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The prosecutor finished. The defense cross-examination lasted 11 minutes. There was very little to dispute. The documentation was precise. The testimony was precise. The man who had been dismissed as a mechanic from Stamford had turned out to know more about a 1973 Porsche engine than every expert Preston Vance had ever hired, and to have documented it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth, if you treat it carefully enough, does not require defending. The judge sentenced Preston Vance at the upper end of the guidelines. She cited the threat against Hannah specifically, in her own words, as an aggravating factor that spoke to the character of a man who, when cornered, reached for the most vulnerable target available. What the court record does not show is what happened in the hallway afterward. Vivian Ashworth was waiting outside the courtroom doors. She had been there for the full 47 minutes. When Ethan came through the doors, she did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked at him. And then, from somewhere down the corridor, small shoes on marble floors, came Hannah Whitaker in her plaid school skirt and navy cardigan, her wooden toy car in her right hand, brought by Mrs. Sullivan, who had driven from Stamford that morning without being asked. Hannah walked to her father and took his hand. Vivian looked at the two of them standing there in the pale January light of a federal courthouse hallway, a man in a pressed shirt and his 7-year-old daughter and a carved walnut toy car, and something moved across her face that had nothing to do with $4.2 billion under management. She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. Then she composed herself. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when words would only diminish what they mean. In the lobby behind them, 3 members of Vivian's legal team began to applaud. Then the forensic accountant. Then James Holloway. Then, one by one, the others who had been present for the case, until the sound filled the corridor, and Hannah looked up at her father with wide, wondering eyes, and he looked down at her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. On the last Wednesday of January, Vivian Ashworth came to the garage on Pacific Street carrying a leather-bound book. It was Hinrich Müller's original work log from 2010. His daughter Annalisa had sent it personally on loan so that Ethan could hold it before it returned to the archive. Vivian set it on the workbench without ceremony. Ethan opened it to page 47. His own signature, 24 years old, in the apprentice authorization line. And below it, in Hinrich's small precise hand, a note in German that translated, roughly, to this: "The American apprentice has the hands. Whether he will have the patience, only time will answer. I am inclined to believe he will." Vivian told him there was a vintage restoration program at Lime Rock Park, 45 minutes from Stamford. They needed a senior technical lead. Klaus Reinhardt had given them one name. Ethan said he would have the conversation. Before he left that day, he made one request. The other workers at the estate garage, Marco and the others who had assisted quietly without recognition, he asked that their wages be reviewed. Not as a condition, simply as a request from one working person who understood what it meant to be looked past. Vivian agreed, without hesitation. There is a version of this story where Ethan Whitaker is the hero because he solved a mechanical problem. But that is not quite right. The real story is simpler and older than any engine ever built. A man who had lost everything, his wife, his former life, the country where his teacher had believed in him, chose, in the silence of his grief, to keep doing the work with the same honesty and care that Hinrich had taught him. He did not announce himself. He did not ask to be recognized. He simply put his hands on the work and let the work be what it was. And 14 years later, the work came home. Every person you pass in a day carries a history you have not been told. The mechanic in the grease-stained shirt, the custodian in the hallway, the quiet one in the back of the room who has not yet spoken. Do not be so certain you know what they carry. Do not be so certain you know what they are worth. True greatness is not measured by the title on a door or the balance in an account. It is measured in the patience of a man who keeps showing up, keeps doing the work, keeps choosing honesty when dishonesty would have cost him nothing but his character. And character, it turns out, is the one thing that cannot be undervalued on any filing, by any man, in any court. Hannah still carries the wooden toy car. She carries it everywhere.